Hello. Okay, now I'm on. Okay. If everyone could please take their seat so we could get started. Well, thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. I welcome all of you to, this is right, our new season's opening lecture. Whether you're here, I welcome you, whether you're here, which we have a record number, or if you're home at Zoom. I'm Deanna Canini, president of the Museum of Newport Irish History, and I especially welcome our members who are so supportive. And those who are not members, I please encourage you to join. As I mentioned, we have an impressive group, over 150 participants this evening. I think we're around 170 actually, and then plus the people that are at home. Our next lecture is on October 20th, a presentation by Timothy Mager titled Becoming Irish American, Dealing with the Early 20th Century. And that is now live on the website. You can register. You can start registering for it. And this lecture will be sponsored by Larry Botley, a valued member of the board. And there'll be one more lecture in November, excuse me, and then we have two lectures scheduled for 2026. So we're having a very busy season at the museum, beginning with the installation in May of, you probably heard, of our new digital display, Tracing the Tides. If you haven't visited the museum, I really ask you to please stop by and see the impressive display. There's so much information we have there from our archives, organized around various aspects of being Irish in Newport County. In July, I think I mentioned in the newsletter, we were honored to host a visit from the Irish Consulate in Boston, who saw our organization as very vibrant in telling the stories of the Irish diaspora as it relates to Newport. Also, because of their faith in us, we received another grant. So to continue our efforts to present additional stories, so we'll be adding content to Tracing the Tides. I hope to see you all on October 10th. We have brochures at the desk, check-in desk, for our fundraiser, Blani, Bologna, and Beyond. From what I know, it'll be an interesting, entertaining, and I'm sure hilarious evening. But we'll see. I mean, I think it'll be, hilarious, but it's all undercover, as nobody knows. So check out the information on the website. Also planned is a tour of the St. Mary's Cemetery given by our own Steve Marino, who's here. That'll be another interesting experience that awaiting you on October 18. Now for the main event. First off, I want to thank Ginny Pitsley. I don't know where you are, but there she is. Hi, Ginny, who has generously sponsored this lecture in memory of her husband, Bill, and their son, Jay. Ginny has been a huge supporter of the lecture series. She's sponsored 5 other lectures before this one. So I say thank you very much, Ginny. Tonight, we once again welcome Dr. Scott Molloy, who is returning for his 6th lecture. So they must have been good. Very good. As I'm sure many of you know, Dr. Molloy is a master in his knowledge of the labor movement and Irish history. He's a professor emeritus at URI, a prolific writer, was inducted into the Labor History Society Hall of Fame and the Rhode Island Heritage Hall of Fame. His extensive archival collection has found homes in the Smithsonian Institute and the URI Library. His lecture this evening will tell stories about the Irish work life in Rhode Island, including some Newport tales. The stories will reflect the transformation of the type of work the Irish were engaged in their involvement in the union movement. So now I'd like to welcome Dr. Scott Molloy as he presents Toil and Trouble. All right, Dr. Molloy.
It's always fun to come to Newport. This is the most educated group that I know when it comes to Irish history and Irish American labor and law. And so I always come down here with a little trepidation. And Ginny, you took your life in your hands by subsidizing anything that I might say ahead of time, because you could get in trouble. But we'll try to keep it civil. But I want to thank my South County friends who braved coming by the tower. You know, a lot of people don't want to do that. And those who had to come over the bridge, even I was afraid to do that. But they're all here, and that's a wonderful thing. There's so many people I wanted to thank for a million reasons, and I'm not going to do it. But one person I did want to point out, that's Dr. Patrick T. Conley, one of the former speakers here, one of the foremost scholars in Rhode Island history, who taught me all about the history of the Irish and Irish in Rhode Island back at PC many years ago. So, Pat, thank you for coming. And one of the great ironies in Irish in the labor movement is that in and around Belfast, in the north of Ireland, there was ship construction. Think of the Lusitania, the Titanic. Those are ones I don't want to brag about. But they had innumerable construction outfits, factories that put out a plethora of goods, and they had British unions in the north of Ireland. All the unions that were in Britain show up in Northern Ireland. On the other hand, the South, without industry, without a base, without an industrial superstructure, had no concentration of workers, and therefore no organized labor. And the South has remained pretty much as it was so long ago, a place of agriculture. Now, the Irish didn't join unions immediately when they arrived here. There weren't many unions to join in the 1830s. And so they were few and far between. But go to work, the Irish did. The Gales made an early appearance at the Portsmouth coal mines. The Weavers made a surprising early curtsy during the textile bloom in the 1830s here in Newport. But mostly the activity of work centered around Fort Adams from 1824 onward. The fort at any given time employed hundreds of operatives and sometimes as many as 500. You had to have 3 skills in order to have a job as a laborer there. 1 was a strong back, 2 was a strong back, and 3 was, as you might guess, a strong back as well. They worked so long and hard, I always say with tongue in cheek, they had graduate degrees in bricklaying and stone masonry. And surprisingly, the U.S. government provided not only housing for these immigrants, but decent housing, and sometimes put up their families as well. And in Newport, as we've learned from Steve and John over the course of their lectures, there was a tremendous tolerance towards the Irish because they were employed. When people aren't employed, when they're poor, when they're homeless, when they have problems, but when they have jobs and they're part of local society, everything's fine. Steve unearthed a stunning contract from 1831, which you'll see up on the screen. And it's between the government and the workforce. And once a laborer signed it, they had to work for a year at the wonderful wage of $1 a day, which was above the minimum wage. There was no minimum wage then, but if there was, it wasn't a bad salary. This one here is signed by John Quigley, who came from County Kilkenny in 1798. He would later retire and become a storekeeper right here in Newport. The agreement called for that 12-month and $1 a day, as I mentioned. But in 1837, there was a financial panic, and the 19th century is punctuated with panics, recessions, downturns, depressions, whatever you want to call them. They came and went with a great regularity. And because of the 1837 panic, the fort cut the number of days worked as well as wages. They went from 12 hours a day to 10. I guess that was good. But they went from $1 a day to 85 cents. Now, J.L. Mason, who happened to be the engineer in charge and was a first lieutenant and kind of the unofficial labor relations guy at the fort, wrote a rather nasty letter to the Newport Mercury newspaper in that time period. And he excoriated the rumors that somehow the government had treated the workers with a cavalier attitude. That is, well, you're laid off, shut up and go your own way. He said nothing could be further from the truth, that the recession just had to have cutbacks. There was nothing you could do about it, and he was quite right. But he also took on another rumor, which I love this one, that the fort was issuing to its employees something called shin plasters. Anybody know what a shin plaster is? Oh, Rusty, you're just shaking your head yes for the heck of it. What is it? Well, almost money. It's like near beer. Almost money. But shin plasters were worthless checks, IOUs, commercial paper. And he said the last payroll had been drawn from the Bank of Bristol. And if you're from Newport and you can't trust the Bank of Bristol, there's something wrong with you. It was done on American gold and Napoleons. I said, Napoleons? I thought that was a pastry, but then I said, no, that was a Bismarck. But anyway, it was French gold coins that were used. What was amazing about all of this was that any government agency, any employer in that era, this is a long time ago, almost 200 years, 2 centuries, that anyone would actually apologize to the workers there, particularly Irish Catholic immigrants, because of shoddy labor relations. Now, in 1844, a hybrid mechanic who also doubled as a Protestant minister. Now, that's an unusual combination. That's like a major and a minor at college. Get a little of each. His name was Seth Hewitt, H-E-W-I-T-T, and his diary has been maintained. In 1844, he organized the New England Workingmen's Association in nearby Fall River. And he held a meeting in Newport and got a decent-sized turnout. I don't know if he had this many, but he had a good show. And he said there wasn't much interest in the labor movement from those people who assembled. And I quote him in, too much aristocracy and millocracy. Well, there's a good word. Millocracy made slaves of the poor operatives in Newport. Some of you are still shaking. That's right. Yeah, I remember that. He wrote in his diary, quote, methinks this screw factory is aptly named, for the very life and energy are really screwed out of the children there. What Hewitt had discovered in Providence was 40 kids who worked at the American Screw Company, child laborers, all between the ages of 6 and 10. 6 and 10, they were there for life, a lot of them, till they got older. And when the local Irish Catholic priest heard about it, he went to the parents and tried to persuade them to pull the kids out of bondage. That's a good word for it. The problem the parents faced, if it wasn't this sweatshop, the only alternative was the one down the street or the one around the corner. They all paid the same, virtually nothing. But for immigrant families, whether it was the Irish or Italians later, that $1 or $2 that the kids brought home was part of an economic unit which allowed them to get by. And so really nothing much was done about the American Screw Company, although, as we'll see later on, Joseph Bannigan, who when he dies in 1898, the richest man in the state, started his career at age 10 at the American Screw Company after 1 year of elementary school. I don't know if anyone else who died that rich, though, who went to work there. But anyhow, for what it's worth. In 1856, there was another panic. Remember 1837, now 20 years later, here we go again. In this particular instance, 16,000 women who worked in the cotton mills of Rhode Island were thrown out of a job. The people who were lucky enough to keep employment suffered a 50% wage decrease that was never restored. Now, in Georgiaville and North Providence, and people in Newport are going, Georgiaville? That's not Rhode Island. Georgiaville and North Providence. The women there in 1858 went out on strike. In fact, it was a statewide. They went out on strike and fought for an 11.5-hour day. You can imagine how many hours they were working. So they're looking for an 11.5-hour day. Imagine how many hours they were working if they were doing 11.5. Zachariah Allen, the proprietor, a famous industrialist who came up with the concept of providing fire insurance for factories, which was a common problem at that time. Okay, this is the strike notice in 1858 following the recession. Allen writes in his diary that he fired all the women, including 8 Irish immigrant girls, his words, and Black Bridget, who sort of ran the operation for the Irish women working there. Allen writes in his diary that she told him that she would take pleasure in putting a bullet through the superintendent some night when he was entering his door. Shades of the Molly Maguires. This is right out of Ireland. They were going to get even. Well, Allen brought in strike breakers, took their jobs, took the pillow from underneath their heads, and that was it. Now, she was called Black Bridget, and you probably wonder why. She wasn't sneaking down to Bailey's Beach to get a suntan during the afternoon. Black Bridget, and anytime they used that word black in front of an ethnic group or an individual, was usually to denigrate them, to bring them down to the level of slaves, black slaves. And so that's where Black Bridget came from. She wasn't complexioned particularly unusually. So that was it. These people walk off into history and you never hear about them again. And here's a Thomas Nast cartoon, which shows a caricature of an African-American and an Irish immigrant on the scales of justice, equal as can be. Black Bridget, right there for you. Which brings us to another fascinating document. In 1868, the Boston and Providence train put out a monthly payroll, as they always did. Now, remember, a monthly payroll, and on the payroll were 30 Celts, 30 male laborers in the work gang. The names were, I can't see it from behind me, but Sullivan, McGrath, McGuire. I mean, it reads like the Irish mob. And what were they doing? They were drawing gravel. They were ditch diggers. It's like calling a garbage man a sanitation engineer. It sounded good, I guess, for consumption, but it didn't change things. If you look at the middle of that payroll, they would list how many hours everyone worked in the course of a month. Of the 30 people, only 5 toiled more than 10 hours in a month. And the few that got beyond that, only by a couple of hours. And then to authenticate the fact that you received your pay, you had to sign over on the right-hand side, or your left-hand side, and 22 of them are all written in the same handwriting, because management had to sign it for them, and then the employee scratched an X through their name. And then the secretary would write on top of the X, his and beneath it, marked, his mark. Our ancestors were so illiterate, they couldn't write their own name. It's a chilling document in many ways to look at. Now, by 1869, African Americans are clamoring to organize. The National Labor Union was the first nationwide labor organization, but they spoke well about things philosophically, but they really didn't get much done. It was a little too early. However, a name that might be familiar to many of you in Newport was George Downing. George Downing was a civil rights champion, a great entrepreneur, and a hospitality maven, somebody who had his fingers in a lot of things. And he wanted to join the Union. And in October of 1869, he held a conference here in Newport and invited his black comrades from Bristol and Providence to attend. He was elected to go to Washington, D.C. for a larger get-together where the group endorsed equal pay for men and women and people of color and whites. 1869. He became vice president of the Colored National Labor Union. The Colored National Labor Union. They immediately declared sympathy with the Irish. What? Yes. Quote, two classes in the United States which when united will be irresistible for the right to vote. Blacks and Irish immigrants. This is amazing stuff. You read it and it's hard to believe, really. The next large manifestation of the labor movement in the United States, and also particularly in Rhode Island, was the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor. And let me tell you, the more illiterate the group was in the Union, the longer title they had. The Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor. Give me a break. What a mouthful. Now, they came to power in the Gilded Age. Do you know about that in Newport? They were secretive at first, the Knights. They went public in the 1880s. They were led by the irrepressible Terence Powderly, who you see in the inset of that trade card up on the screen. He was the Grand Master Workman. A Grand Master Workman. Now, if you're down at St. Mary's cleaning up every year, and you come to a headstone, and maybe there's some writing, but you can't quite make it out because it's still a little bit underground. You scrape away the dirt and the grass and the leaves, and there goes Grand Master Workman. I mean, I don't know about you. If I was a good Catholic, I'd get right down on my knees and make the sign of the cross. Grand Master Workman. Put anything you want after that. Who could ever beat that in life? But Powderly was a skilled railroad mechanic, the mayor of Scranton, Pennsylvania. He was an Irish Catholic activist and a teetotaler. He was an abstinence man. And he got that way, he explained. He used to go to Knights of Labor picnics on Sunday afternoon, the only day they had off. But he was appalled, I tell you, when he saw the girls swill beer just like the boys. And that was the word he used, swilled, like pigs. And apparently they must have drank it and got it all over them, maybe did their hair with it, I don't know. But it must have been a great aroma if you were into beer. Now, the irony was here that Powderly was head of a very heavily Irish union. And his picture was in almost every bar room in Oneyville, the industrial heartland of Providence, even though he wasn't a drinker. I always figured that was pretty funny. The Knights banged heads with the Catholic Church. The church, for time immemorial and even for a while after, did not take lightly to anyone taking an oath to anyone but the Catholic Church. And even though the oath to the Knights of Labor, you didn't have to give your soul to Lucifer or Satan or anybody else, they just didn't want any part of it. And it created a schism to some degree in the church among different bishops. For example, Bishop Thomas Hendricken High School, said, "I, who have lived in factory towns for 33 years, say, Godspeed to the order of the Knights of Labor." Imagine that. The bishop and a lot of others went along the same route. The church, however, via Vatican, interdicted the Knights. They banned Irish Catholics from joining it. Not that that stopped them, but it didn't help either, to be honest with you. In 1882, there was a labor parade in downtown Providence. 5,000 marchers and their supporters snaked through the city streets and then took a steamboat, or a bunch of steamboats, to Rocky Point Amusement Park in Warwick, which was inaccessible by land back in those days. When they got done with their festivities at Rocky Point, by then thousands of people, they stopped with 3 cheers for Ireland. Imagine that, 3 cheers for Ireland. That's how many Gales were part of that. Now, the Providence Journal would complain. Well, what's nothing major about that. Nothing, you don't even have to laugh. The Providence Journal complained, quote, "The Irish have told us so much of the tyranny and oppression of England, yet when they come to this free country, allow themselves to be led by a few of these same Englishmen who bring the terrible bitter spirit of the trades unions, whose practice has been more tyrannical than of any existing government on earth." Can I think of one country? How about England and Ireland? Oh, yeah, well, forget them. Imagine that we were somehow an incubus. The Knights of Labor in Rhode Island had their own weekly newspaper, The People. They had a discount restaurant and clothing store for its members. They pushed educational reform and amazingly set up a daycare center in the basement of a Protestant church in Oneyville, so the young Irish Catholic mill girls going to work at Atlantic Mills would have a place to leave their kids in safety until they get out of work. That's something America hasn't come to grips with today. And yet here's the supposedly backward labor movement advocating it and putting it in practice in 1885. Just amazing stuff when you think about it. One great episode between the Knights and management deserves a little more detail for us. Down in Woonsocket, some people are going, "Is that Rhode Island?" I don't know where that is. Joseph Bannigan ran the Woonsocket Rubber Company, rubber footwear. He was a famine refugee. Whoop. There's a Knights of Labor cartoon, anti-Irish, a hard carrier. Bannigan came here in 1847. You can see his emigration ticket up on the screen. He worked at the American Screw Company, as I mentioned earlier, got into rubber, became a producer, imported more rubber from Brazil to Rhode Island or the United States than any other person. He was an innovator, an inventor, and he hired the Irish almost exclusively. 90%. And he taught them a skill. So they wouldn't be just left dry with a decent wage. They now had a skill they could use over time. Bannigan implemented a primitive workers' compensation system, medical benefits, although of a limited nature, and recycled used rubber so as not to waste it. He was an environmentalist. In the mid-1880s, half the workers in his mill in Woonsocket owned their own homes. Unreal. Nobody owned their own homes in those days, particularly rubber workers. But here in Rhode Island and Woonsocket, they did. Now, Bannigan also was very philanthropic to the church. set up an orphanage, an aged asylum, St. Mariah's home for working girls. But his largesse sometimes got clipped due to bad weather. What the heck's that all about? If it rained, or if it didn't rain, if it didn't snow, if it didn't sleet, if we didn't have blizzards, the market for rubber shoes and boots went down the drain. And so everyone knew that when that happened, there would be cutbacks, both in the number of hours or days, as well as curtailments of wages. So in 1885, oh, here we go again, another recession. Bienigen was forced to cut wages. Everyone expected it, but something happened this time. Unlike past experience, Bienigen didn't forewarn his workforce to tell him it was coming in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Did he forget? Was it an oversight? Was it on purpose? I couldn't never find the answer to that. His workers felt disrespected. These Irish immigrants, huh? Disrespected. That's a wonderful thing. So much so that one February afternoon, soon after the announcement was finally made, but too late for them, they all walked out on strike because they had been insulted by Bienigen for his lack of telling them what was going to happen. Now, John Holt, who was a beloved superintendent of the operations at Woonsocket, went and pleaded with the strikers at the factory gate and asked them to come back and take the leftover material that was still on the workbench because rubber, like produce, rotted. It spoiled. And so they had the workers turned around and went back in and did it. They finished everything up and walked out on strike again. You can tell they're Irish. Now, as time went on, a myriad of other issues cropped up because this thing stretched for a while. The workforce complained of vulgar, and I say vulgar, ways. They also didn't show, and I quote, gentlemanly conduct to the employees. I've seen a lot of union contracts, but I've never seen anyone ask for gentlemanly conduct on behalf of management. But here they go. The strike soon devolved into Irish Titan versus Irish toilers, loggerheads, if you will. Bienigen acted like a Protestant landlord. He said he would never yield to his workforce, the ungrateful workforce. And he held open press conferences where he answered everything openly and honestly. Total coverage in and around the state. The strikers then joined the Knights of Labor. And they then went and organized the 12 or 13 other rubber shoe companies in New England so they couldn't undercut one another. They all went on strike. So it became a regional outwar. And the Knights would say, and you can see the regret in their voice, quote, Mr. Bienigen, who turns out the best boots in the country, is himself the smartest rubber man in the world. But he has failed to allow us to place the crown upon his head, unquote. Kind of a sad thing that this came to what it did. The Knights of Labor regretted these recriminations, quote, when tyranny was carried to the most extreme point, like landlordism and eviction in Ireland. Bienigen at this point, in the middle of the strike, was notified by the Holy See that he would be inducted into the Knights of St. Gregory the Great. This is the Catholic Church's highest philanthropical order. Bienigen would be only the second American to receive it. Amazing situation there. And we've just come across the original metal. It's about 3 inches long. It's over at the URI archives here. I don't have it in my pocket. It's beautiful. And so it's there for you to go and view. And it's embossed in the middle of it or in the back of it. It says Chevalier Joseph Bannigan, Knight. Knight Joseph Bannigan. Quite an item. I've been looking for that for 25 years. As this Irish Civil War, because this is what it became, it was no longer a labor management conflict, it was an Irish Civil War as it continued onward. In July of 1885, 60 armed strikers from the Knights, from Bannigan's Mill, attacked a scab boarding house in Woonsocket. I think it was a Motel 6. And they had a shootout. Both sides peppered each other, and a lot of people got wounded on either end of it. Bannigan complained that the Union was receiving money from liquor dealers. This was something the Journal and the Yankees usually tossed at the Irish. At which point, Bannigan then announced that he was going to hire 300 American-born scabs. American-born. He's Irish-born himself. This was another slap in the face to his Irish operatives. Now, at this point, Father Michael McCabe, born in County Leitrim in 1826, ordained in Providence in 1854, the parish priest at St. Charles in Woonsocket, was just closed, unfortunately, in the last 10 years. He's the Vicar General of the Diocese of Providence. Father McCabe sets up a meeting at the basement of St. Charles Church in Woonsocket with about 50 members of the Knights of Labor, rubber workers on strike. And he says to them in incredible language, "Are there not many men who came here from Ireland, who received good wages, who, without work in the rubber plant of Woonsocket, would be obliged to go to the coal mines of Pennsylvania and work for starvation wages, or in the building of railroads amid the snows of winter in the far west?" Unquote. That's quite a plaintiff to these people. The Knights, feeling their oats, stood up, turned their back on Father McCabe because they think he was too pro-Bannigan, and walked out. They interdicted the priest. This is what the church did to organizations, not the other way around. It became the talk of the town, the region, and Catholic America, that Irish Catholic parishioners would dare to do something like that. But again, the Knights were showing a whole new seam in American society. The Knights of Labor went on to threaten to shun Bannigan's footwear. See where this brings us here. Okay, hold on. "We will use Captain Boycott in your market," they said to Bannigan. Boycotting an island received the blessing, the approbation, the sanction of priests and prelates. It is as necessary here in Woonsocket as it is in Ireland. And the original boycott was in County Mayo in 1880. And Ginny Pitsley sent me a note long before I had this put together mentioning the boycott. And here it shows up in Woonsocket just 5 years later. And the word itself enters the vocabulary globally. It's a noun, it's a verb. It's when you refuse to work for somebody or to have nothing to do with them, to shun them, so to speak. Father McCabe remained strong-willed, more than the Titan and more than the toilers. He got the bootmakers to return to work in October after squeezing Bannigan for concessions, a wage increase, and the rubber master agreed to rehire a group of violent untouchables, he called them. Those people he said he'd never hire, but he's going to. The third day back, the third day back from the strike, from February to October, Bannigan distributes a new list of rules and regulations. They're really not much different than what they were before, and they're not much different than any other company or factory. It's boilerplate language, except of the 21 provisions, the workers would label the 21st, Bannigan's 21st commandment. And this is what it said: regular attendance at some place of public worship and a proper observance of the Sabbath will be expected of every person employed, unquote. The irony, of course, and here's the 21 rules and regulations up on the screen. The irony, the Irish Catholic must have had perfect attendance wherever you went. Anywhere in Christendom. They were always in line to go to worship. Who squealed the most, however? The Yankee elite and the majority of the population in Rhode Island, because remember, as they would, this is the land of separation of church and state. And they would drag out that old quote, what a beautiful one it is, from Roger Williams, the state's founder in the 1600s. Forced worship, he said, forced worship stinks in God's nostrils. Must be the only time I've ever heard anyone refer to the Lord's appurtenances on his face. This case, his nostrils. The rubber workers, upon receiving the 21st commandment, walked out on strike again. These people had no shame. Apparently, Father McCabe and John Holt, the rubber master, and Bannigan's father-in-law, and also an English immigrant to Rhode Island who converted to Catholicism, worked out the deal while Bannigan was in Ireland. When he returns, he is livid. He said he never approved all of those things, and he might renege on the agreement. Father McCabe then writes a letter to the editor, well, to a number of editors, quote, I made promises to the bootmakers which Mr. Bannigan will not sustain. He tells me I have no right to make promises. And parenthetically, the priest says, I could have settled this a long time ago. I guess that was telling him. Bannigan, in the face of widespread opposition, the Yankees, the church, the strikers, the Irish, he backs off and lets the agreement go into effect without the 21st commandment being there to stick him. The importance of this strike, and you can spend forever on this stuff, is that the average Irish worker bit the hand that fed them. And you say, well, is that a good thing? It is when you're striving for respectability, that you no longer have to be in the shadow of paternalism, that you can stand up for yourself and think for yourself. And you can tell by the way they wrote and spoke, they were a pretty intelligent group of people, even if a lot of them were illiterate. From there, the next grouping is the American Federation of Labor, and in the state they call the Rhode Island Central Labor Union, white male, skilled, high dues-paying workers. And there was a slow overlap between the Knights and the AFL in the 1880s and the 1890s. Now, the new kid in town, the Central Labor Union, would publish a couple of directories in 1899 and 1901 in which they sketched the different craft unions they represented and the leadership. This is a rare insight into working class Rhode Island, complete with innumerable photographs. And this is John McMarrow behind me. He was the head of the Central Labor Union. He was born in Ireland in 1860, came to the U.S. in 1877. He ran the Brewers Union, not to be confused with the German Brewers Union. This was the Irish Brewers Union. They were very, very sensitive about that ethnic stuff when it came to their beer. McMarrow was also involved in the Robert Emmet Literary Association, lived on Atwell's Avenue, one of Ray McKenna's Federal Hill Irish. Michael Donovan from County Cork was a cigar maker and a Hibernian. And the Irish Shuckers and Cullers were members of the Oystermen's Protective Union. Who would have thought they had a union back then? My favorite of all, the only woman named in these two volumes, is Mrs. Patrick Lizzie Quinlan. Very attractive lass, originally from New Jersey. She was a dressmaker. And in this picture is now the president of the Horseshoe Nailers Union. She was in charge of quality control in an age of horsepower where the size, the length, the width of that nail could mean a horse being buckled up or not. And I have to say, from going over all of that my own guesstimate is that at least 50% of the membership of the Rhode Island labor movement in 1900 were either Irish or Irish American, and that was reflected in the leadership in about the same number. So the Irish were everywhere when it came to working in that time period. Another craft was the Rhode Island Central Labor Union, was the Newport Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners. Joiner is simply a cabinet maker. You can see the three ribbons up there. They're all from Newport, all Labor Day parade ribbons. The red one's the oldest, probably the 1880s. The one in the middle, Newport Central Labor Council, 1895 Labor Day, and then Local 1203 of the Carpenters Union here in Newport from around World War I. In 1892, the Carpenters went on strike. They sent out the striking members to keep an eye on the railroads and the boats to make sure scabs weren't coming in. And one day they caught 3 of them and dragged them up to the Union Hall. And I'm reading these secretary's notes from the 1890s. And I swear he's going to write, and then we killed them. But no. Listen to what he says. We paid their way back to Boston and carried their luggage to the depot. What had happened is that the unscrupulous employers had advertised good-paying jobs available in Newport, just show up. No mention that there's a labor struggle going on at that particular time. So that's quite a funny little story. Transportation unions tended to be heavily unionized. The railroads were all union, the brotherhoods, but most of them were English. They were Yankees. That was a monopoly they held on to. The highest paying jobs, it was like being an airline pilot today if you were a train engineer. And so they got the best of the best. And the Irish settled for less. But the Irish made their mark on the street railway system, the trolleys, the streetcars, the electric vehicles. And this is the top of a dance program from the Newport division of the Newport and Fall River Street Railway, Division 688. Of the 200 people there, 20 were Irish, but in Providence, the number was much higher in terms of Hibernians being employed. Brutal conditions. And one day while tooling around on my bus on Cranston Street, my gregarious personality, you know, people like to bring me things. Sometimes food, sometimes God knows what. But one day a guy got on, he said, "Scott, I know you like to collect these historical things. I thought you might want this photograph. It means nothing to me." And there it is, and I'm looking at it. And to your far right, on the third row up, with his shoulder against the American flag, is my Roscommon-born grandfather. Only in Rhode Island. Only in Rhode Island. From there, we then go to the Teamsters Union for a minute, and here they are, 8 horses pulling what was probably an industrial load of coal to a factory somewhere nearby. By World War I, the Irish had become skilled bricklayers, iron molders, carpenters, and with the Great Depression and the New Deal, the 1930s political gunpowder launched the most prominent Irish American labor leader ever, John Fogerty. Born in 1913 in Mount Pleasant, his grandparents were Irish immigrants. They moved to Harmony early in his life so they could have room to grow food for their expanding family. They woke up one morning soon after arriving. A cross was burning on their lawn as a warning for the Irish and the Catholics to stay out of rural Rhode Island. In 1924, just a few years later, the Ku Klux Klan held a rally in Georgiaville, just down the road from Harmony. 10,000 Rhode Islanders turned up to support the Klan that night, and they came to hear a harangue, not by me, but a harangue by U.S. Senator Heflin from Alabama, who, when asked by the Providence Journal what the Klan stood against, he said, kikes, hoons, and Catholics, all spelled with a K. Catholic spelled with a K. Now, John Fogerty went on to become a bricklayer, president of the Bricklayers Union. He ran for Congress in the 2nd District in 1941. He was 27 years old. He was reelected 14 times in a row. The only foe, the only opponent to ever beat John Fogerty was death itself. Otherwise, like some of those Southern congressmen, he'd still be there voting for us. Now, Fogerty comes on the national scene in one particular incident. Back in 1947, George Marshall, the Secretary of State, came up with a plan to stop the spread of communism in after World War II and the beginnings of the Cold War in Europe. And they did that by the United States spending a lot of money to rebuild the ravaged Europe at the time. In 1950, Fogerty, from his perch on the Appropriations Subcommittee, amends the Marshall Plan. And he amends it in language that's kind of peculiar. He says, no more money will be given to those nations whom have client states. That's a client state. You know, I can kind of figure it out, but not quite. The client state was that Britain got $1 billion in 1950 from the U.S. and then sent $150 million to Northern Ireland to maintain partition. He outlawed the use of that money to go to a colony. And he overthrew that law for 3 days. At which point the international incident that it created led to the overthrow of his efforts. But it was a military victory, really, in many ways. John Fogerty. I've saved one important piece about the workforce towards the end here. Irish domestic servants. 60% of Irish women who came to America found employment as domestic servants. They were cooks, they were helpers, they were nannies, they did all that type of housework. And even though they got hired, there were some Yankees that held out. This is hard to, it's a little rough, but wanted a girl, German, Swedish, Nova Scotian American, or colored to do general housework, no Irish need apply. That's in Providence, 1887, in the Providence Journal. No Irish need apply. They were called the Bridgets. They were not unionized because there weren't enough of them in one particular work setting. But in the summer of 1902, about a dozen Irish and English women walked out, led by Bridget Lynch. They walked out of the Elms. You know, the Elms up the street. For a few dollars, you can get in. But the owner was Edward Berwin from 1848 to 1936, German heritage. He fired them all. A Newport paper commented, quote, "The fashionable women here may have to do their own housework. And their husbands go out and do the chores around the villa." Wow. Berwin was the largest coal distributor in the United States, the largest, which is saying something. He ran his own bank. He was on the board of directors of 50 influential corporations. And in 1902, he was at the eye of the hurricane in the famous 1902 coal strike, which threatened to freeze America to death at the end of 1902. It wasn't until Teddy Roosevelt, no friend of labor, but a trust buster. He didn't like monopolies, and he didn't like Berwin. And he threatened to nationalize the coal industry. I mean, this is a plank right out of the American Socialist Party and Eugene Victor Debs. To hear a Republican even whisper nationalization, oh my goodness. Berwin backed down. And they finally settled it, and the workers in the mines got a 10% pay raise. In Newport, the Central Labor Union, on October 1902, just near the end of the strike, holds a fundraiser. Here it is in that ticket for the striking coal miners. Amazing how these things connect. In ending, did he say what I thought he said? In ending, the two words you've been waiting for. In ending. In 1875, a Celtic servant girl dies while in the employment at an East Side mansion in Providence. The proprietor looks through the trunk, finds odds and ends, no big deal. Comes across a piece of Irish linen. He opens it up, and out falls a piece of Irish turf, a piece of Irish peat, a memento, a remembrance, a keepsake of what could have been if she had stayed in her own native country. It was a way to remind herself of how far she had come for good or for bad. The owner was overtaken. He contacted the Providence Journal, who sent a reporter out, and he said to the journalist, quote, "Such patriotic love of country was to me a revelation. And I must confess that a lump came into my throat," unquote. And he ended by saying, and she was only a cook. She was only a cook. And our first inclination would be to respect him as a caring individual. He was. But in the larger picture, the old Yankee, like his associates, could not imagine a poor Irish girl embracing and understanding an abstract issue like patriotism, which to them was in the purview of the wealthy and the influential. And she was only a cook, and so are we, her humble ancestors. She was only a cook. Thank you. Keep that machine.
All right, do we have any questions for Dr. Molloy? Do you have a microphone? Oh, Ann has a microphone. Any questions?
Just wave your hand if you have a question, and you can speak it into the mic so the people at home can hear.
Okay. Well,
After I said you were the smartest group I ever talked to.
Yeah, I said,
Oh, we have,
All right.
I have a
If you- if
question.
you-
Dr. Conley just told me I got a C for my presentation.
yeah, if
have a-
you do have any questions later, you can please submit them. You have one right there, Ann?
We do. At the beginning of your speech, you'd mentioned that the south of Ireland is modern day, mostly agricultural. I just wondered, what makes you say that?
The agriculture in the south, what?
You said the south, you'd mentioned the north and then you said the south is modern day. It remained as it was, pure, mostly agricultural. I was just wondering what you meant by that or
Oh,
why?
I mean, if you go to Ireland even today, obviously, industrial growth, there's pharmaceutical industries and other things, but I mean, by and large, it's the Emerald Island still, and it's because of agriculture. It's not to say they stood still, but they never had the concentration of working people that they had in the north or in England, which made the big difference. Because if you don't have a base on which to build a foundation, you're not going to have a union or anything else.
If you do think of questions, you can always email us at the museum and we would forward them to Dr. Molloy. Thank you. I also, this is the fundraiser we were talking about, Lonnie, Maloney, and beyond. So back here, if you're here to buy a ticket for it, if you haven't already, but we appreciate you'll enjoy yourself. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in November for our, October for our next lecture. All right, thank you very much. Have a good evening.